All right, that was Griselda Lewis. She's been on the ground covering the aftermath of the devastation caused by the floods. All right, let's now cross to my colleague Iman Rapeti. She is at the Virginia Airport in Durban, which is the nerve center of the search and rescue operations in Virginia Airport in Durban in KwaZulu-Natal. Iman, a very good evening to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome.
Good evening, Simpiwe, and very good evening to all of our Full View viewers. I'm live for our program at the Virginia Airport in Durban in KwaZulu-Natal, and it is a hive of activity. This airport has been transformed into the logistical and operations nerve center for search and rescue operations here in the province. You'll see on the runway strip just behind me some personnel getting ready to go off on a mission. They receive their orders here every hour, every shift change, and they are deployed and they respond to whatever the crisis is at that given moment. A lot of their calls for help are channeled through the 10111 number. So that is a very busy number right now, and it keeps the personnel on the ground here really busy. Throughout the day as we've been here, you'll see rescue vehicles arriving and leaving. You'll see the search and rescue teams come in to get some water, to get some refreshment and some rest before they deploy it again. In fact, that's the reason I couldn't show you. Just to my right is the area where they just sort of rest and recover. It has been a grueling couple of days, I can tell you, based on conversations that I've had with some people here. We're going to talk to volunteers towards the end of our program as well about how they pull together a relief and distribution effort on the magnitude such as this one. But I also want to let our visitors, our viewers know that we have a jam-packed program for you this evening. We go live to our reporter in the field, Griselda Lewis, in just a moment. We are also going to talk to a volunteer who works in these situations where you're dealing with death and recovery, and we'll talk about the trauma associated with that. We will also talk to a family who's lost someone. And I think it's only fitting then that we also have a clinical psychologist just to share with us what it takes to kind of recover and piece back your life. But for right now, reporter Griselda Lewis is with us. And Griselda, I see the dust is still fresh in your shoes. We're here with the volunteers as well. We'll talk about them in a moment. But you've been on the ground in one of the worst affected areas in KZN, and this is in Tuzuma D. We saw these harrowing scenes even of cemeteries, being flooded out and bones rising to the surface. A very, very traumatic time for the community there. Tell us what you saw today.
Absolutely harrowing, Iman. If you look at the days of stories that we've been covering on the ground where communities are telling us about the loss of life, and in particular those who are still worried at this stage as we move into this weekend of people worrying about where their loved ones are. You remember that government has indicated that there are still a number of people that are missing and unaccounted for. So at this particular stage, there are those who will go to bed tonight not knowing where their loved ones are. Right here where we're stationed is where you had the rescue and recovery teams move from, and we've seen them go out to some of the most devastated areas. Yesterday we were also in an area where a 10-year-old boy had gone missing, and his father just sat on the banks of that river for hours hoping that the rescue divers would come up with something. It didn't happen. He went to bed last night, and when we left, Iman, he came to me and he said, "Are you leaving?" And I said, "Unfortunately, we have to. It's going to be dark. They will not be able to do their work. Perhaps they will come back again tomorrow morning." I could see the agony in his eyes, and that is, the scene of multiple families and families that have lost also multiple family members. So you're looking at families where 4 members of one family have been completely wiped out as a result of this. It's absolutely harrowing.
As you relate that, it just gives you a sense of the deep, deep trauma that families are living with tonight, and a great deal of uncertainty, just not knowing, what's going to happen next. The length and breadth of this province has been devastated. What are some of the other scenes that you've witnessed? And I think, as the days have passed, it's more than a week now. How do you witness communities? What are their experiences in the main, even among those who may not have lost family members but have lost their property, everything they own?
Iman, it's devastating because what they're calling for is more help, and what we're seeing here is resource that is obviously going to some of the most affected areas. South African National Defence Force, the rescue teams, have gone out to areas where they've assessed and found is where the dire need should be. But everyone is desperate. In the areas that we went to yesterday via an Oryx helicopter, those are areas that have been completely shut off. You can't get emergency services there. You can't get any help coming to that area. So that's where the Oryx helicopters come in. So absolute devastation. They're talking about how government could have done better in bringing about aid and relief much more earlier. And when you talk about rescue teams, remember for these families, Iman, every second that clicks, that the clock ticks, is a moment of desperation for them, because their loved ones, they don't know where their loved ones are. So as the clock ticks, you wonder if you're going to find that 10-year-old boy alive. You wonder if you're going to find that old man or woman alive. So it's absolutely harrowing. They're calling on government to do more. But from what we're seeing here, of course, these teams are being deployed to various areas. Another area that I went to in Greenwood Park, there was a lady who'd been trapped for 10 days, Iman. So this is resource where you had rescue teams that had to be there for 10 days. The agony, the grief that I saw on the faces of that woman's friends was just unbelievable. When I saw the amount of rubble that had collapsed on her roof, you could clearly tell she was not going to survive.
Griselda, harrowing scenes indeed, and thank you so much for that update. I know that you're also going to go rest and refresh, and we'll have some more, of course, coverage from the rest of our SABC News team. You can see just behind us the volunteers are busy packaging for the rest of the evening. All right, so one of the key things, I think, is to look at the history of floods in KwaZulu-Natal. This is not the first time an event like this has happened. In fact, if you look at the research as far back as the 1800s, KwaZulu-Natal, Durban in particular, has been dealing with adverse and inclement weather. And I recall, even as a young girl, the Conward interchange, which was quite a high interchange, as a schoolgirl, being completely submerged underwater when the Umgeni River broke its banks. So to share some information, some insights and some light on what has been a history of tragedy with regard to adverse weather events is our next expert, and he's Professor Takudzwanashe Mabhaudhi, who's a climate change expert from the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Professor Mabhaudhi, thank you so much for your time this evening. I don't know if you ever thought you'd be on a runway strip talking about the history of floods in a context where it has literally just hit and devastated so many families. Share with us what you know of the history, and welcome, by the way.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for having me in this makeshift studio of yours. Certainly not what I had for a Friday evening, but I think one thing that we should take into consideration is KwaZulu-Natal, amongst the provinces in South Africa, is the highest flood risk assessment. So it is naturally prone to flooding. Hence the risk of floods that we've experienced in KwaZulu-Natal 1981 due to a tropical cyclone, 1987 again, which then until now was the worst flooding that we had experienced. And then 2019 we experienced the devastating landslides that we all watched and saw, and we had just recovered from that, and in comes this latest devastation, which is not comparable at all to the previous flooding instances that we've seen. So it's getting worse and worse.
Well, what's interesting is the frequency. I mean, you saw Demoina in '84 ravage parts of the province. You saw another one just 3 years later, which is recorded to have been, one of the worst tragedies on record for KwaZulu-Natal. You mentioned the 2019 moment where a landslide just wiped out 70 people. In the 1987 incident, I believe it was upwards of 500 people that perished, 500 souls that perished in that disaster. And now we find ourselves April 2022, counting the number of people who've lost their lives, who've lost their possessions, and for whom life will never be the same again.
So it's really tragic, and I think the biggest call for us now is, as we reflect on these floods and the history that we've had with flooding, we no longer really have an excuse in terms of not preventing the massive loss of life, not preventing the loss of livelihoods. So 2019, this is 2022, and we're still losing lives, and we know that it's going to flood again in the near future. So I think we really need to be better prepared. The president has said it himself, that we need to fund climate change adaptation in South Africa. We need to fund disaster management in South Africa so that the impact, a hazard will still happen. Flooding is a climate risk. It's a hazard, but a disaster, there's a man-made part there in terms of how we respond.
What's your sense of how well documented these historic events have been? I mean, people like yourselves, historians who look into the sepia-tinged, books in our libraries and in our archives. Of course, a lot of them have been digitized now, but understand the history in ways that a lot of us are forgetful of. What are some of the key lessons? You've mentioned some of them now around better planning, but in your mind, what are some of the key lessons we need to learn to prevent further loss of life like this?
I think the key lesson really is around anticipation. We're living in an age of information. In the past, information was not as readily available as it is. The technology was not as good as it is. The communication was not as good as it is. So a lot of things could have fallen in the holes and led to impacts being escalated because a message simply couldn't get through to the next person. But now the technology is advanced, the communication is advanced, and we have ways in which to pick these floods. I know the system that eThekwini has managed to pick it up, but unfortunately because of the load shedding and other things happening around that time, the messages to the PowerMate community could not really get through to them on time. They couldn't evacuate. But those are things that we should be learning from in terms of how do we better prepare, how do we better respond, how do we mitigate, and how do we recover from this so that we do not fall into the same place again.
What about accountability? We're sitting here, you and I. A little bit later on, I'm going to be joined by the Premier of the province. I'm going to be joined by some political parties. And some of the things that they are bound to say would be about preparing for the future. Whereas those plans, based on all the things you've just said, ought to have, in some ways, have been implemented in the present to mitigate the exponential adverse effects of this particular event. What is your sense of, and maybe this is crossing your territory just a little bit, but I know that historians have a political view. What is your sense on politically what should be happening now in terms of accountability for this tragedy?
I think politically the government has taken accountability. The president, was in the province. He spoke quite strongly about what is happening. He declared a national state of disaster, and he spoke about the urgency to fund climate change and to increase it, which was an acknowledgement in itself that there has not been enough funding. So one of the challenges that we have, eThekwini is very progressive. Their 2014 action plan is a world-based document that is being used as a template for other cities globally. But the implementation of translating that policy intent into practice, a lot of the things that failed in this particular instance that were needed and that are still needed are mentioned in that action plan. But the funding, building the capacity, having the right people in the right places, and being consistent in how we deal with the challenge of climate change, that's important.
Well, often in this sort of high pressure time that we live in with social media, where everything is happening with hyper speed, we don't really apply ourselves to the detail of the information, the detail of the history. What do you think people need to know in looking back at these major tragic events that we've had in South Africa with regard to weather that we're not as focused on now? What are the blind spots we have in our understanding of that history, Prof?
Okay, I think one of the blind spots that we have is when we talk about climate change, we talk about it as it's something that is still to happen, but the reality is it is underway, it is happening. What we have been experiencing, whilst we cannot really attribute this singular event to it, but in many ways we have been experiencing increased variability in our weather. We've been seeing more weather extremes happening, more flash floods. It flooded in Gauteng, it flooded in the Free State, Ladysmith recently. We're seeing droughts. So we've got a lot of these, extremes that are happening. And the fact that, we get time in between, it's not time in between to forget and move on. It's time in between for us to regroup and really come together and face the reality that our lives are changing. The environment in which we have lived in is changing, and we need to be prepared for that reality on a daily basis.
Yeah. Sometimes I wish, we could etch words such as your own into stone and put them, everywhere so that people could see it and becomes really a part of our consciousness and our attitudinal lifestyle in the way that we behave and exist in society in a responsible and accountable way. Professor Takudzwanashe Mabhaudhi, thank you so much for your time this evening. We appreciate you coming out all the way to Virginia Airport. Get home safely. We're going to continue our coverage here at the Virginia Airport, which is the logistical and operations center for search, rescue and recovery efforts here in KwaZulu-Natal. It is in Durban. We're going to come back, and when we do, we're going to talk to a volunteer whose work it is, to go and find people like the ones that Griselda was talking about earlier on, who are trapped, whose bodies may need to be recovered, and really to be with the families for whom tragedy is a never-ending nightmare. We'll be back after this.
Jay, when